within that framework. In the meantime, of course, I mean, they'll always be looking for other kinds of, work on their own trade agreement and see if that works, maybe do both. But I think in the long term, if the rationalization that one sees in terms of corruption IPR makes sense, it also makes sense that they will rationalize in terms of trading policy and blend into the global economy fairly smoothly over time. I mean, the WTO positive impact in China was just huge. There is just no question about it. And so if they're not in the major trading agreements, it's going to make a difference over the long run, and I think they realize that. In terms of poverty, I agree with what Andy said. I mean, it's been very impressive. Although you can go to places in China that you just can't believe how poor they are. And most of these places are like in other countries. They're in the deserts where they don't have access to water. They're in the mountains. They're remote areas. They're ethnic minorities, right? That they're the hardest ones to bring, to really help. And some of the policies are, well, if you're in a mountain area, we're going to help you by moving you, right? So this idea of moving people to cities, to towns, I mean, that's kind of the answer. And in places like Ningxia, where it's desert and people, were working in coal mines and hardly had any water and couldn't grow food, so they moved people closer to the Yellow River and gave them plots of land, and so they became farmers. But the problem with that is then the water table started to fall because there really isn't enough water in Ningxia to support even the population that's there. So there's a lot of constraints and issues around that, but they're clearly very aware of it and working.
Thank you.
Well, I think time is up. I'd like to ask one last question to ask panelists to comment on. As you are aware that China put a stop at the family plan, they allow second child. That has huge implications for political stability, economic development, and a business prospect. I'd like 3 panelists to comment on the future. In 10 to 15 years, when Chinese family no longer has 1 child only, has 2, what's the impact for economy, politics, and business? Penny, start.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure they'll all have 2 children. Some of the analysis is that even without the one-child policy, that the population growth rate was falling, and sort of the standard kind of way that we see with development. My take on it is that the policy did push it ahead of sooner than it would have happened, and so there'll probably be some choices, but the people who had to have only 1, who wanted 2, now they're too old to have children, so they're out of the picture. So I talked to one of my students the other day, and she's a 1990s Zhou Shihou, the child. So she said, well, okay, so we can have 2. So we're going to have 4 grandparents and 2 children, and the 2 of us are going to take care of them all. It's like the worst possible situation. So she didn't seem very thrilled about it either. In general, I think it's good to let to let the choices. I mean, let families make those choices, and it's about time.
The one-child policy actually provided that if you were a one-child child and your spouse was a one-child child, you could have 2 children. The number of people who could have 2 children and did not is actually surprisingly high. Most Chinese have opted for 1 child because of the cost and because of the burden of taking care of them. People who wanted 2 children tended to have more than 1 already, and they would simply pay the fine, particularly if they were in the middle class. I don't see a huge, I'm not a demographer, I don't see a huge surge in the number of children among the middle class, the urban professional middle class. Whether you'll see it among the working class, in the countryside, there may be some, and of course, because of sheer numbers, that group would have the larger impact. But the one-child policy, because of this provision, about one-child children, we already know that most of them opted voluntarily to have one child. Having a child in college, I can tell you it's bloody expensive, and I'm glad I only had one.
When I was at Noel Rubbermaid, which sells baby products, they own the Graco brands, Teutonia and Aprica, which are big in Asia. They're constantly doing research on birth rates, and of course, China being a very promising market, I had seen some research done in China, which basically bears out the same thing. My colleague said that the rate of increase would only be slightly impacted by any change in the policy, because what is happening is that rising income levels, typically what you see everywhere else is, as income levels increase, the childbirth rates decreases. Europe is having that problem, Japan has been having it for much longer. So with the group of people that have the higher purchasing power in China, that's already happening. So that's going to be very hard to reverse by policy, but the lower income levels will probably tend to increase. So that if that's happened in other countries, happens in China, I think that will probably be the biggest, or that'll be the biggest impact of that policy.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly have my perspective. I think it will have a huge impact on education. Change the social structure that will directly related to economic development. The housing will be occupied by 2 children. Family are going to look for more resources. And I think that fundamentally will change China, which will permeate to every field in the next 20 years. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for their insightful comments. I want to re-recognize Georgia-China Alliance, Fang Lei and Guanmin. You are one of the 3 partners for this China breakfast briefing.